I read this novel as not having a very happy ending to me.
I just, again, want to reiterate that Harriet just gets raked through the coals through this whole novel. It's crazy.
I don't think it's particularly happy for Emma either.
Yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so here's why. Welcome, friends, to episode 219 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Jane Austen's 1816 novel, Emma. All right, we're back in the genteel world of Regency-era England for our second Jane Austen novel. We did Pride and Prejudice last year. But that was our first time doing this kind of book, and now we're revisiting. And Austen didn't have a very long career, but this one comes towards the end of it, whereas Pride and Prejudice was towards the beginning. So it's a little bit of a bookends, kind of. There was one novel that came out posthumously, but this was the last novel that was published while she was alive. So it's pretty late in her career. So it's an interesting little kind of bookend to that.
I assumed that this was after Pride and Prejudice because it just felt like sort of re-evaluating the genre a little bit, finding other ways to tap into it. Still, some of the same themes are touched on, I think, like, you know, romance is at the core of it. And even if you don't think the main character maybe has some romance in the storyline at first, which I found to be like refreshing and fun, and you're like, oh, it's, you know, love is very romance and love is very core to the story, but it's not specifically about our main character, and then, you know, we get the story unfolding where that's not the case.
Early on, she says something about how she would never marry. She doesn't think she's ever going to marry and all this stuff. Very different than was it Elizabeth Bennet? This Emma is a very different kind of character. And I think we're going to be comparing those two a little bit. How did you like this book? How did it compare, first off, to Pride and Prejudice, but then just in general as a book? How did you like it?
I think it felt very similar to the way that I felt about Pride and Prejudice, with the caveat being I think I enjoyed this more. So this isn't our typical genre. I'm not super well versed in romance, and I would consider this almost like a romantic comedy, or like it's kind of a funny book. It's
called a comedy of manners, I was seeing is technically what it is, but you're right, it is supposed to be funny. And I think realizing that was part of, I had a kind of a journey with this book, I think, and that was one of the things, was like realizing, okay, this is supposed to be a comedy.
The way that the main character views the world, Emma, right away sets you up for, you know, a strong character, a clever character, and that continues through, but the way that the story unfolded, like, I found myself enjoying it a lot in the beginning, and then there's sort of a lot of that status that we you know, became accustomed to with Pride and Prejudice, that Jane Austen, I think, has a fascinating relationship with, because we talked about her life and the way that she was writing, maybe sometimes about societies that she knew about and sometimes societies she didn't know about. This one especially, Emma, has an interesting relationship with status in the way that, like, there can be like virtue signaling that happens with like the upper classes, but at the same time, I think it's like wish fulfillment sometimes for people to read these sort of stories of high society, of things that they get up to because they don't have to work all the time. They can live these lavish lives, and they can afford to play matchmaker. They can afford to play games with people's lives, and the way that can be like a thing that you see as like, oh, that would be so much fun, but at the same time, the status of playing with someone's life as someone who is a high status person within this society is kind of, you know, I think Jane Austen's taking a side there, kind of saying like, isn't this, it's interesting and something to strive for, and I find it interesting as well, but also look at the dark side of it in ways.
Well, there's a little bit of an inherent conflict between, at least that I was picking up on, between the narrator and Emma. So for the most part, we're close to Emma's point of view, and even at times we get that sort of direct thought that is almost as if dialogue, yet it is not in quotations. And this is a very common technique that's used in modern writing, but it was still pretty new, and I think Austen is sort of famous for doing this, and that's one of the reasons why she's considered one of the first people to write like a modern novel, is using techniques like this. And while that is occurring, there is still a sort of a disconnect between that and the narrative voice at times, where the narrative voice feels to me almost like Austen herself, or maybe just like an older person who's part of the same society, who is maybe a little bit judgmental of Emma, kind of knows a little better. Tough to say who exactly it is, but at the very first line of the novel is Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition, had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. And so you can start to pick up on a little bit, there's like a little bit of judgment there, right? Like, she's like, oh, she's great, but there's been very little to bother her.
Never worried a day in her life.
Exactly. So it's almost like a faint praise, like damning with faint praise kind of thing.
But also at the same time, someone who's gone through a lot might see that and say like, oh, if only.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I read that there was a quote from Austen where she said she wanted to write a heroine that no one but myself would like very much.
Wow.
Which I think has proven to not be true, because a lot of people do like Emma, but she kind of set out to make Emma a little bit different than her other heroines and her other novels, I think, deliberately. And it's interesting to see how that played out. But I want to talk a little bit about my experience reading this book. So last year, I think when we did our last looks, Pride and Prejudice ended up being my least favorite read of the year. And it wasn't that it was a bad read. It's just not my... Like, ultimately, we all have taste, right? And we all have things that interest us. And for me, it didn't interest me that much, and it felt a bit loaded with a lot of language and a lot of fluff that if you're there for the fluff, you're gonna love it. But if you just find it kind of then it's a lot. And I had a similar problem with this book, where there's a lot of this. We're going to explore the nuances of this very specific society and the very particular manners they're using. And it's the interplay of these characters with very subtle, different social standings and tons of misunderstandings. There's lots of misunderstandings in this book. And how those all intersect creates some tension and some irony and some funny situations, but also some drama. But it's all at a remove to me. And that is just not the kind of writing I typically like. I can appreciate it, right? Like, I can appreciate that the language is extremely rich and clever. And if you look at any given paragraph of Austen, you read it, it's like, okay, I can see why she's so beloved, because this is really well written. And it's kind of like Shakespeare in that you can really look at it and suss out a lot from just how rich the language is. And it's funny because we just covered Shakespeare. So I had a similar journey with this, where I had to sort of accustom myself to the language, like we talked about with Shakespeare, where I had to get used to it and kind of fall into a rhythm with it. To where I could even feel comfortable sort of following it. So that was part of the journey. And then the other part of the journey was I had to realize, and at a certain point in the book, to me, I realized that there was somewhat of a mystery going on. And I didn't get there for a while. I was like, why? What is the point? Like, I don't care about any of this. She's just kind of messing with Harriet. She's trying to do her sort of matchmaking stuff. And like, it's moderately entertaining. I think her father's hilarious. Like, there's certain things that I really liked, but like, for the most part, it was a lot of just kind of like moving stuff around and not much is happening. There's not a lot of plot in this book, which I read some of the initial criticisms of the book at the time were like, it's got some interesting characters, but there's no plot.
I found myself when I was reading Emma thinking about Pride and Prejudice, and then also thinking about how, like, I don't know when Emma was written specifically, but how it seems to me that it's sort of like a watershed sort of project, at least in terms of like you said, modern romance, almost like romantic comedy. And then it got me thinking a little bit about other things that it's like, and I was thinking about shows like Downton Abbey, and this idea of like it being so much about status and the interplay between the characters.
Well, that's also like Regency era, right? Or is it a little bit later? I haven't actually watched it.
Yeah, it's later.
I'm aware of Downton Abbey. I've never watched it.
There's another show that's, I believe, from the same creators now on HBO called like The Gilded Age, and it's, again, that sort of thing. It's high society. How people are interacting within and like vying for either, not even necessarily vying for power, but vying for status and the outward appearance.
Reputation is like everything, yeah.
And I think that it's this particular genre that you either like really click into or really don't. But after even saying that, I find myself somewhere in between. It's yeah, like I do enjoy it. I like watching it, but I will admit that it's not the thing. Like, I don't choose to watch it, but when, say, like I watch it with my girlfriend or something, I do really enjoy it. I'm like, oh, I understand.
I am also making a distinction between this book and films in this genre, because I actually really enjoyed the Pride and Prejudice film that we covered. A lot more than I even expected to.
That's a good point to make too, because I think I agree with you.
I think there's something about condensing it down to like a 2.5 hour thing, and giving performance, much like with Shakespeare. Like it breathes life into the language in a way that is kind of more difficult for me as a reader. And once again here, I found myself looking forward to the movie, because I think I'm going to get this story a lot better, and I think the comedy is just going to land. Now, of course, it's modern, so it's going to be modernized in some way, but I'm really curious to see how faithful it is, how much they change the jokes, which ones they decide to lean in on, and which ones they avoid. I'm really curious for that. But so I was saying that I feel like this is kind of a mystery, and to me, it was this mystery. The mystery that carries throughout is who likes who, and why are people behaving strangely, and what is Emma gonna like misunderstand next? How is she gonna somehow like try and do something that is gonna like confuse somebody, and it's going to make somebody else think that she actually wants this one thing when she really wants something else, and then they're gonna be talking about, one character, but then she's gonna think they're talking about a different character, and why, what's going on there? Because there's some sort of stuff going on in the background. There's some secrets, right? And I started picking up on like, okay, people got some secrets, and we're going to get some reveals eventually. I will say I did pick up on Mr. Knightley being the eventual love interest for Emma pretty early on.
It kind of, and I agree. I picked up on it pretty early on, and you know what it was for me was their banter, the way that they argued, and the genuine nature of that, and it reminded me of Pride and Prejudice, where like the arguments that they get into are the you can't see the forest through the trees, or you can't see what's right in front of your nose, because you're so focused on like this idea of somebody who I could end up with or something like that, and I don't know if it's a trope that she leans into, but I do kind of like it because it's true. In my opinion, it's true to life. Like everybody goes around thinking, "Oh, my soulmate is out there somewhere," and like I think when you realize like how life works and how genuine love connections can be, it isn't this perfect thing, this idealized version of a relationship. And I think once you wrap your brain around that, then you can. I think you'll find your soulmate very quickly.
So. I mean, I agree with that. But so one thing that I find really infinitely fascinating about Austen, and it's not something I appreciated until we covered Pride and Prejudice, is how short her career was, how she did not have fame while she was alive. And we can talk about like this is like one of her like more well-known novels, and even then it's not much.
In terms of sales, or what do you mean?
In terms of sales. So like here, let's just tell you about it a little bit. So Emma was written after the publication of Pride and Prejudice and was submitted to London publisher John Murray II in the autumn of 1815. He offered Austen £450 for this, plus the copyrights for Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility, which she refused. So she had written both of those books, I think, between the two. Instead, she published 2,000 copies of a novel at her own expense, retaining the copyright and paying 10% commission to Murray. The publication in December of 1815 was dated for 1816, like in the actual book, and it consisted of a 3-volume set at a selling price of 1.1s, which is 1 guinea per set. So I don't know how that all converts but I was reading that like I think of Sense and Sensibility did not, like, one of her books did not sell well at all, and then like this sold okay. Mansfield Park ended up selling well, if I'm remembering correctly. Regardless of which ones it was, basically like her novels that were selling well were selling just well enough to cover the expense of publishing the novels that didn't sell as well. Her novels were exploding in popularity in France. But she wasn't seeing a dime of that because it was unlicensed, people just translating it, and there was no copyright or anything.
You've yet to name, like, I've heard of all of those titles, you know, like those are all like kind of massive landmark novels.
Well, yeah, I mean, she didn't write that many books. Let me pull up the bio. So we talked about her bio more extensively in Pride and Prejudice. So if you want to hear more about Jane Austen, which I recommend you do, 'cause she's a very interesting person, check out that episode. But yeah, I'll just say, you know, she died when she was 42 from a mysterious illness. We don't really know. She died in 1817. So this book was published in 1816. So wow. Regardless of how well it did, she wasn't around for long to like see anything from it. She had a novel called Persuasion that would come out after she had died. But it really wasn't until we talked about it last time. It was like this period of time lapsed, and then all of a sudden, insanely popular. Like it exploded in popularity, and her books have been in print ever since.
I mean, one of the most notable authors potentially ever, right?
Right. So novels. She wrote Sense and Sensibility in 1811. So we're talking, she published 1811, and then she died in 1817. You know what I mean? So Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, then Mansfield Park. Now, Pride and Prejudice did make a little bit of a name for her. In particular, aristocracy and people of this like social standing really liked these books because it was all about them, basically, which makes sense because I feel like that was mainly her audience, was who she expected to like these books, right? So Mansfield Park, 1814, Emma, 1815. Then she wrote Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, and Lady Susan, but those all came out posthumously. Lady Susan in 1871, so way later. Northanger Abbey came out in 1818, as did Persuasion. So those are books she had written before she died, but came out later. So, I mean, that's it. She has some other like stuff she wrote, but not novels. So, you know, prolific during her time, but very short publishing career. And then she, you know, died very young. What I was trying to get at is to me, it's really interesting to look at the legacy of this writing, because it seems clear to me that she was writing with the expectation of the people who are of the class and character of these people are going to be my main audience. And then maybe other people will want to read about it because they'll think like, oh, this is kind of cool. But like, I don't think she thought it was going to be ever would have dreamed it was going to be some sort of massive hit. Right. And it's gone on to become that and essentially create a genre in and of itself. And I'm curious if she had any inkling of that happening while she was alive. Maybe she had heard about the publication in France, so maybe that gave her a sense that like maybe it is kind of popular. It's interesting that it has gone on in our modern day to continue to be popular, because there's something about this period that people gravitate to, and this lifestyle that's it's like kind of fairy tale. It's like, I don't know, it's like that comforting, warm thing we talked about, right? Like, to me, I always think of like my version of this is like Middle Earth, like Hobbiton, the Shire. Like, it's something that like it makes me feel at home and warm and cozy. And I think a lot of people feel this way when they look at Regency era like houses and clothing and like balls, and like they just feel like this is like peak life, you know? And even if it isn't really, there's just something appealing about reading about this kind of world and these kind of people.
I continue to think that there's some universal things that people relate to and also like are drawn to, like this idea of people wanting to live in a world where their biggest worries are what the person down the street thinks of them. You know what I mean? Those kinds of things it's a great escapism tool, not to mention just like fascinating interpersonal relationships and things like that. But then also between these two books that we've read, I found key relatability attributes to these characters. Like Emma, for instance, has has this high status, is rich, all these other things, clever, and then at the same time is a character who doesn't apply herself. And I think everyone can see themselves in that at some time or another. Like you feeling like you're not fully applying yourself in the way that you could be in order to be as successful or to do whatever you want to do. I think that there's
or at least you know somebody like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think people build. I think Jane Austen building that into her characters helps to make it relatable to whoever reads it.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And so there is a relatability in the characters, somewhat. So there are things I liked better about Pride and Prejudice, and there are things I like better about Emma. I felt like Pride and Prejudice tapped into the emotions in a more raw and passionate way, whereas Emma often felt removed. We'd come up to a sort of powerful moment that could have happened, and it would happen, but we'd be told about it through like a filter of it would become like described instead of given as a scene, and it was like I felt like the author pulling back. Now you could say that maybe that is her sense of sort of decorum, and that is like it's not like proper for this genteel person to be like talking about the passions of these characters.
Fade to black kind of thing, like time to, pan away to the window.
Well, that's for like a lovemaking scene, but we're even talking about like the moments where like, one character comes on to another one, or when, like professes their love. A lot of that we don't get in direct dialogue. We just get like it's reported to us that it happened. And I felt like there was more direct engagement with the sort of emotion of the moment in Pride and Prejudice, which I like in my writing. Like, I want to read about the powerful emotions of these situations. I want to connect with that. I want to feel them vicariously through the characters. And when that's denied to me, I would get frustrated. And so that's one of the things I got pretty frustrated with this novel, on top of everything else I already kind of talked about that keeps me back at a distance. The refusal to like get in there and get to the emotional core of these scenes sometimes bothered me. I get why she did it. I think it was a choice. But it just, again, it doesn't really appeal to the kind of writing I like to read. But I think Emma is a lot more interesting, flawed character than Elizabeth Bennet. I really like how sort of clever and self-destructive she can be, and without even realizing it. Like, she's too clever for her own good, so she doesn't realize like how she's like potentially hurting people or screwing things up for herself, because she's just kind of bored and wanting to like mess around with stuff and talking circles around people. I like that kind of a character. It's interesting to me.
I remember Elizabeth having a little bit of that,
she did
like
too,
being
yeah.
kind of one of the smartest people in the room, but like I understand what you're saying with Emma. Like, there's something about her character that like that is her character. Like is getting up to no good, almost like mischievous in like a not in a dark way.
Well,
though.
and she lies to herself a lot. I noticed she would repeatedly come to the realization that she'd made a mistake, and then she would double down on it or make the same mistake again in a different way, even after she just talked about how I'm not going to do that again. Like, she'd immediately start doing it again. And I was like, this is all intentional, right? It's like it's something to do with like the lies that we tell ourselves sometimes or something, or like the ways we can like talk ourselves out of things or into things. And that was interesting. That was all interesting to me. But this book is long, and it felt like there was a lot of this kind of stuff, these little manipulations, but then also these conversations where you're sort of sussing out little hints and breadcrumbs at the mysteries. And if you get really into it and you really care about who this character likes, and you really truly care about, the fate of Harriet, who she's going to end up with, and you really get into that, I think you're going to like this book a lot more than I did, because ultimately, while I have a passing interest, like I get that that's what this novel's about, so I'm interested, it's not something I'm like dying to know. Like, I just don't care that much. And because of that, those scenes tend to be more dull to me than they are to someone who is really bought in on the discovering the mystery of this.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same page there. Like, while I did enjoy many scenes in this story. There were some that I was like, oh, I really want to get through this because I'm not super interested in what's happening right now. So little vignettes where there'd be like a scene, somebody would meet with somebody, there's a dinner party, something. And like a lot of times, like the wittiness of the characters talking back and forth and just like I was into that, but then it felt like some of the scenes were kind of dragging along, and it is a pretty long book for how light of a story this kind of feels like it is in a sense.
Well, and you don't get those emotional beats that I connect with. I was missing like strong emotional beats for me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And, and honestly, I've only read it once, Pride and Prejudice, obviously this, and maybe I've conflated it a little bit with the movie, which I did like quite a bit. So I'm wondering if that might be coloring, because, yeah, it might be coloring my opinion of the last book a little bit. I don't know.
It'll be interesting to see how this movie will color our opinion of this.
Yeah, exactly.
This book here.
I think if you're ready, I'd like to get into summary so we can actually talk about some specifics. So Emma begins by asserting that the eponymous protagonist has every advantage that an early 19th century young lady could wish for. Emma Woodhouse, who lives in a fictional town of Highbury in southern England, has good looks, intelligence, and a £30,000 fortune, which means she never has to leave Hartfield, the home where she lives with her doting father, Mr. Woodhouse. When her governess, Miss Taylor, leaves Hartfield to marry Mr. Weston, Emma is left with ample leisure time. As she has no inducement to marry, she decides that she will occupy herself by making a match for her new friend, the unsophisticated but beautiful Harriet Smith. She urges Harriet to reject the proposal of a young farmer, Robert Martin, in favor of pursuing Highbury's handsome vicar, Mr. Elton. When Emma's long-standing family friend and brother-in-law, Mr. Knightley, learns of her interference in Harriet's love life, he criticizes her, warning that she is so deluded by Harriet's beauty that she overlooks the stigma of her lower social status, which will deter higher-born suitors, such as Mr. Elton. When Emma sees that Mr. Elton is a willing participant in her schemes to get him close to Harriet, she thinks that Mr. Knightley will be proven wrong. However, when she learns that she is the true object of Mr. Elton's intentions, Emma is humbled and resolves to do no more matchmaking. Yeah, we got all these different guys introduced. I felt bad for this farmer guy.
I felt bad for Harriet.
Harriet, of course.
The entire time.
She likes him. She likes this farmer Martin, Mr. Martin. And Emma's like, no. He's a farmer. You can do better than that. And she's basing it off of nothing. Like, she doesn't know anything about Harriet other than Harriet's beautiful, which I think the narrator kind of points out. And this one, like, the sort of way that Emma repeatedly goes to class is like she has people in boxes, right? And I know that's the way the society works, but like, for whatever reason, it was more egregious for me this time. I was having more trouble, like, accepting that that's the society we live in. Because if you think about it, like, I read a fantasy where there's like a princess and a king and a prince and like they have servants and they live in a castle. Like, I know it's inherently unjust, but I'm like, I'm along for the ride. I'm like, okay, they have servants, it's fine. But here, for whatever reason, like, her talking shit about this farmer and how he's like not, like, he's fine, but he's not good enough for you. Like, I don't know, it just bothered me more. And I think it maybe it does come back to like the genre and the like period, like what is the thing that you like attach to at a young age? And I think a lot of people at a young age, like, this kind of stuff is their thing.
And like, I think the other difference being that like fantasy is it's just that, it's fantasy, whereas this is like pretty close to the real world.
True.
So you're seeing these people treating people differently, and you're like, oh, this person's lower class, you can't, and you're like, well, that's a working class person, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's too real almost, because it's, actually how our society has functioned for a long time.
Right. But I do feel like you have to kind of shut that off to enjoy this book. Right?
Yeah,
like,
I think so.
Because if you start thinking too much about that, it's gonna bother. You're not gonna like any of these people, right?
Right.
And that's not the novel you're reading.
I'm waiting for the Jane Austen book where somebody's just like, anarchy, and they're just running around.
Yeah, no, that doesn't happen. Okay, so let's see other characters we want to talk about here. Mr. Elton. So Mr. Elton, there's like a really funny scene where Emma has painted Harriet, like a portrait of Harriet. And Mr. Elton, and she's like, she knows that she didn't do a great job. She's like, it looks okay. I tried to make Harriet look as beautiful as I could, even if the proportions aren't perfect, right? And so then there's this conversation starts happening about like whether or not the proportions are right or like how well it was painted. And then like Mr. Elton comes to her defense. He's like, oh, no, you don't see that that's all the artist's eye and it's the intention. And like he's defending the art clearly because he has feelings for Emma. But she interprets that as he actually really likes Harriet, and that's why he's defending the art of Harriet, because he finds her to be beautiful. And these kind of like subtle misunderstandings are like that's the bread and butter of this book. Like it's a bunch of this kind of stuff happening over and over again.
Where like if people were just communicating more openly.
It's because they're all speaking in this like coded language and nobody can say what they mean. Everybody has to kind of talk around it. Yeah, it's like the language is kind of fun, but it's also kind of frustrating in that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It also plays back into that thing I was talking about before, where like all of this is a game, right? These people have so little going on in their lives that everything they do is a game. Even the way that they talk to other people, they have to like try to maintain this facade that they're smarter than everybody else, they're more interesting than everybody else, they have better hobbies, better friends. That in itself leads to people sort of messing that up along the way, and like you said, creates drama.
Yeah. So, I mean, we are eventually going to find out here about Mr. Elton. I think I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but I do want to mention just Mr. Woodhouse, her father. I loved his lines. Like, he just constantly, like, at first I think it's supposed to be kind of annoying, but like, I don't know why it just turned to completely hilarious to me. But just how I think there was a moment early where he was talking about how you don't want to go outdoors, because outdoors is notoriously like bad for you. He's like, you don't go outdoors. And it was so like over the top because he's so worried about health all the time. And he's worried about the sea. Like later on he starts talking about the sea and the sea air and how it's bad for you. It'll give you a cough and you'll get a cold. And then it's like, and then he's talking about like being around people who've had colds and like, I don't know. He's like so obsessed with his health. First off, kind of relatable in you know, these years, but like, how much he comes back to that, like that's his sole defining characteristic, is like he's always complaining about like this room's drafty, you know, like this, he's that kind of guy. He wants to drink thin. We should all have our gruel now. This gruel needs to be thinner. Then you get I can never get a properly thin gruel, you know. And it's like he's like, I don't know what it is. It's so weird.
Didn't we have a similar didn't we have a similar observation on Elizabeth's mother or something?
Yeah.
Or her father, maybe?
No, I think it was her mother. So I did read somewhere that this book could be viewed as a gender reversal of Pride and Prejudice. And a lot of the major characters have like sort of flipped their roles. I didn't look at the exact breakdown, but like there's a lot of these like where exactly like it would be the mother is now the father for Emma. That kind of stuff. I don't know. I saw some of that. It wasn't something that I had like thought of myself, so I didn't pursue it. But I did see that somebody had made that observation that maybe she was playing around with the idea of just sort of gender swapping a lot of these characters and seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, just reversing the whole like genre that she's created. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I think we talked about this in our last one. Like people don't know. Like it seems to be the consensus that she was sort of conservative in her political life. Yet you can look at a lot of these books as being kind of feminist, but only to an extent, right? And so like you can read it as a feminist work, or you can read it as like a conservative, you know, like staple. Like you can read it either way. And it's because like she's creating sort of strong women within this society who are capable and vivacious and passionate and intelligent, right? And that's not the typical women that you would see in books of the time. And those are the characters people love. Like they're the main characters, right? Like you're attaching to the women of these books. And that in and of itself is a kind of a feminist act. Yet a lot of the messaging of the book sort of is all about a return to status quo. And we can talk about in this novel, another return to status quo happens at the end. So I don't know. It's an interesting debate to have, and it's fascinating because you're talking about a person who had such a short life and wasn't famous in her time. So like it's impossible to know at this point, right? We're just going off of like some family members who kind of knew her talking about her 50 years later, and like
yeah. And it's interesting to think like artists don't do things most of the time. Artists don't do things by accident, right? Like if you're adding these sort of things you're intentionally changing the story in a certain way, and to add that layer is to, have thought over it a lot, and then also to not only have just thought over it once, but then repeated, like returning to that idea, feels to me like I don't know, how could I possibly pick the brain of somebody from 200 years ago? But it seems like,
it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like
it has to be somewhere in the middle. Yeah,
it's obviously she's not a radical feminist. Like that's not what these books are. But I also don't think it's accurate to say there is no hint of feminism in these books, when I think there clearly is.
Because, like you said, the characters for the majority of the books do push against the status quo of the time.
Yeah. And they're finding ways to strive for independence and agency within this very boxed-in world. Which, again, like this book in particular felt almost like they were in a prison of their own making. Like, it's a very fluffy, nice prison, but like they're stuck in this. Like, she's stuck at home and she doesn't get to leave by the end.
There's that scene where the character, I forget which character it is just talking about her carriage and her how nice her carriage is. And I kept thinking about how these, like, they're just like they're like going about town looking out at the riffraff.
Yeah.
And like they're in their little cages, like you said.
Yeah. And that's not really what the book's about, but that is like a subtext, kind of. I don't know. And it's like, is that even really there within the text, or is that just our perspective on it? I don't know. Okay, let me read the second paragraph here. The new year brings some new arrivals to Highbury. These include Mr. Elton's new wife, the overbearing Mrs. Elton, Jane Fairfax, the accomplished, attractive niece of Emma's tiresome neighbors, and Frank Churchill, Mr. Weston's son from his first marriage to the highborn Mrs. Churchill. Frank claims that he had to keep putting off his visit to Highbury owing to the interventions of his aunt, Mrs. Churchill, who disapproved of his parents' marriage. For Emma, Frank is the most eagerly anticipated of these arrivals, as he is reportedly a handsome young man of about her age, and she is eager to be romantically attached to him, even if she does not wish to marry. While Frank is undoubtedly attractive, he and Emma fall into an easy friendship, as he entertains her unfounded notion that cold, reserved Jane Fairfax is passionately in love with her brother-in-law, Mr. Dixon. Although Emma understands that she ought to pity Jane Fairfax, who will have to leave her comfortable life with the family who raised her to become a governess, she cannot help disliking Jane because the latter's talents make her feel inferior. Guided by her dislike of Jane, and by Frank's affirmations that he finds Jane unattractive, Emma overlooks the clues which indicate a secret attachment between Frank and Jane. If you don't know this novel, and you listen to that, I think you're a little confused. And that's kind of how the plot of this book goes, right? There's a lot of this, like, this person likes this person, and this person shows up and is talking about this person, and it is an insult to this person, and there's a lot of misunderstandings.
This is where the mystery element comes in too, right? Like this whole section is kind of the mystery section in the middle. Which I did find to be engaging once it started to get going in earnest.
So let's talk about Jane Fairfax, because I think this is sort of an interesting character who isn't really super fleshed out, but is someone who Emma is clearly envious of. And her envy of her makes her dislike her. And this is not a very, I don't know, attractive quality in a person, right? To have this sort of thing, like to
envy, like
like being jealous of someone and then disliking them because you're jealous of them. I guess a pretty shitty thing to do.
Of course.
So,
but people are irrational, and like having a flaw like this, I think some people will see this and think there's a relatability to that, because people are jealous, people are envious, and you can see that becoming so intense that you might hate somebody.
Sure.
Like,
and I agree with that. I think it's great that Emma is so flawed, but there is she does feel bad about it later,
right?
But I felt like I was still kind of denied the kind of comeuppance that I thought you would usually get from this kind of thing.
I couldn't stop thinking about how Jane Fairfax in another Jane Austen novel may have been the main character.
Yeah, she has kind of an interesting story, right? Like she was an orphan. And she's now potentially going to lose her status because she's going to become this governess.
Isn't that sounds so similar to Pride and Prejudice to me, just off of memory.
Maybe.
I don't remember for sure.
I can't remember for sure. But like, and then the reason they, we're about to get into, there's a reveal that she's secretly engaged to Frank. And the reason they kept it a secret is because the aunt would disapprove of him marrying someone who doesn't have the like prospects and the sort of riches because of her, sort of like unsteady ground. And that, like, I don't know, like, she's already, like, her place in society is so unsteady compared to Emma's, who's, like, pretty solid. I'm like, why are you jealous of her? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely irrational. I agree with you.
Yeah. And I think maybe we're maybe supposed to read that it's because Mr. Knightley seems like he kind of likes her. Like, not necessarily romantically, but he feels sorry for her. He's impressed by her. He likes her singing, I think, or her playing. And
doesn't he get after Emma? Like, he gets pissed at Emma because she's treating her this way.
Well, sure. He's the one who kind of scolds her throughout.
Or you know what it is? I think she doesn't she make a dig at Jane Fairfax's grandmother or something?
Yeah. So you're talking about what's her name, Mrs. Bates?
Yeah.
So Miss Bates is another pretty funny character, and her whole thing is she just talks and talks and talks. She just goes on and on and on, and she just like prattles on, says everything. And it's pretty entertaining. It's just funny to see all these other characters like trying to get a word in edgewise, and her just like barreling over them and just going on and on about like inane things. And then there's like one of the biggest like turning points of the book comes later on when, as you referenced, Emma sort of insults Mrs. Bates about basically calling her out on like saying, she says something about like, she needs to say 3 dull things in order to like interest somebody. And she's like, well, you shouldn't be limited to that. Like, or you're going to say way more than that. And it was pretty insulting, I guess. And I don't know, it didn't seem that bad to me, but in
this society, it's like a whole, like, how fucking dare you?
Not cool.
Yeah.
And then like, Knightley comes in and tells her like, you got to think about the life she's had. She's had a really difficult time and like all this stuff. And then Emma feels really bad about it. Yeah. But again, like a lot of the emotion is sort of removed. I don't know.
I felt like this was one of the more like emotional scenes.
It is,
because it was clear how much this affected her. And she was like crying and sobbing and yeah.
Right, but it's still sort of reported. It's kind of reported that she spent the next few days crying about this. It's told to us. Oh, she felt so bad and she cried about it for a few days before she, and it's like instead of like a scene with her thoughts engaging with the emotion is what I'm saying. I felt like it was sort of denied to me, but it's stylistic. It's a choice. I do want to. So this whole Mr. Elton thing is interesting, right? Like he clearly likes her, and she thinks he likes Harriet. Knightley has basically told her that she's wrong about this, and then there's this ride they take in a carriage, and he professes his love to her in the carriage. And it's like the most awkward thing she's ever experienced. She has to shut him down, and she's like, "Oh my God, how can you like me? You've been coming on to Harriet all along." And he's like, "I haven't come on to Harriet at all. What are you talking about?" Because everybody's misunderstanding each other's motives and actions. And that was a moment again that is reported in a way. I wanted that scene, and because that scene would have been interesting. And instead, we get it secondhand, kind of, and that's like an example of what I'm talking about. It's like the emotion is there within the story, but it's not given to us.
Yeah, I totally get it. I see where you're coming from.
All right. So meanwhile, tensions rise between the Eltons and Emma as Mr. Elton resents that Emma judged him only worthy of marrying her lower status friend. Moreover, Mrs. Elton covets Emma's centrality in Highbury's social scene. The Eltons take out their frustrations with Emma on Harriet, especially when Mr. Elton publicly snubs her at a ball by refusing to dance with her. Mr. Knightley comes to Harriet's rescue, and soon after, Harriet confesses to Emma that she has an anonymous new love interest. Emma, who has just witnessed the romantic incident of Harriet's rescue by Frank from a band of itinerant individuals who threaten her, imagines that Frank is the new love interest. Later, when Emma learns that Frank and Jane have secretly been engaged and breaks this news to an indifferent Harriet, Harriet delivers the blow that the object of her affections is Mr. Knightley. A horrified Emma realizes that she does not want Mr. Knightley to marry anyone but herself. She puts purposeful distance between herself and Harriet, fearing that she has lost Mr. Knightley forever. However, Mr. Knightley confesses his love for Emma, and they get married. Harriet, meanwhile, through a chance encounter, finds her way back to Robert Martin. As they have married into different social classes, Emma and Harriet must be more acquaintances than friends. And I think we end the novel with several marriages in a row. Everybody gets married. Okay, so a lot of big reveals and sort of stuff here happens all at the end, and I definitely have thoughts about a lot of them. But where do you want to start?
The big moment that I think a lot of people are going to gravitate towards is the moment where, Emma feels all is lost. She thinks that she's not going to be able to get Mr. Knightley, and this, the way that then Mr. Knightley conveniently also loves her back, and everything cascades from there. That moment of not realizing you want something, I think is an important one in this story specifically. I already kind of hinted at this idea, but you can't see past your own wall that you've set up, and she just wasn't interested in seeing someone like Mr. Knightley, because if she was to get married at some point, she saw herself with someone like Frank, or she saw herself, she kept assuming who she should be with, and then didn't allow herself to see the thing that's more genuine. And I think maybe sort of the repression of this era is to blame too. You're supposed to be with a perfect mate, and some of the time it's arranged, and then in this situation they bicker back and forth. They have this interesting relationship that you wouldn't think is traditional in this era. So when she finally does realize it, she's like, oh, I love him because I legitimately love him. So I think that'll be a big moment, especially once we see it in the movie. I'm sure it'll be played up for massive reveal drama.
So yeah, I mean, I'm going to be curious to see how it plays in the movie. I have kind of a different read of the ending of this novel, which I'm going to get into. But first, I want to touch on a scene that happens leading up to this, and that's this attack. It happens off page.
Yeah.
So they use a term that is not, it's considered racist these days, but it's for a group of Romani people who attack them and try and rob them and do very it's kind of a racist characterization of people like this. It's kind of this knight in shining armor moment where Frank can come in and save Harriet, and Emma thinks oh, this has sealed it now. This is the moment has created a romantic, pathway for this love to flourish. And then when when Harriet starts talking about how she actually thinks she loves somebody else now, she's like, oh yeah, this is working. It's going to be Frank now. But she's actually talking about Mr. Knightley because he saved her at the ball. So again, misunderstandings. But it was just a weird moment. It did not feel appropriate for this novel to have this happen. And again, I don't think it aged very well. It was clearly someone who doesn't understand these people at all and just finds them to be kind of threatening, and just tossed them in as a throwaway. What's a threat? Okay, some Romani people, although they use the other term. Yeah,
that's exactly what it was. Just literally who do I not feel safe around? Or,
exactly.
That kind of thing.
That
something...
gave me that that rich white scared of anyone who doesn't look like them. Anyone who's other. So that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But okay, so all that, I'm going to set that aside. I just wanted to note that happened, and it was kind of strange. But then we get back into the crux of the novel. I read this novel as not having a very happy ending to me.
I just, again, want to reiterate that Harriet just gets raked through the coals through this whole novel. It's crazy.
I don't think it's particularly happy for Emma either.
Yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so here's why. So, Emma only realizes that she loves Mr. Knightley when Harriet says that she loves Mr. Knightley. And to me, we've repeatedly seen Emma. She's very clever, but she's not very in touch with her own emotions. And I think what she's not actually experiencing an unearthing of some secret love she's had. I think this is jealousy again. because she has a connection with Mr. Knightley where he talks to her frankly, and he scolds her, but he's kind of a father figure for her. In a way that her actual father is not, because he's just too busy worrying about it being drafty in whatever room he's in. And so she immediately starts thinking about how, like, that is going to go away. And that like, panic about that going away, I think she conflates that and thinks it's, like, romantic love.
So you think this is a situation where, like, this marriage is just doomed to divorce eventually, or just unhappy?
Who knows? Or just being unhappy. But, like, Emma is such a, like, clever, I don't know, like, she doesn't want to get married. She's said it repeatedly.
She's independent.
She has instead decided to marry this guy who's been around her since she was 13. He talks about how he's loved her since she was 13, he was 29 when she was 13. Yeah. He's 16 years older than her.
That's fucked up.
That's a bit weird. And he's always been like a father figure to her. That's not usually what you want in a romantic relationship. You only want more like equals. It seems like she's someone who needs an equal who she can like have some sort of like back and forth with, where this feels like it's going to be more traditional. He's going to serve the role of the wise man who's going to kind of like tell her how things are. And I didn't get any sense that that's not how it's going to play out. Now, like, there is definitely some like trappings of this being a happy ever after kind of stuff going on, but I felt like the subtext was actually it's not gonna be. She's not gonna be that happy. I think she's gonna be kind of miserable and realize that this isn't what she wanted.
I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah, I definitely see that now. It'll be interesting too, right? Like, I'd love to hear from our listeners, because I'm sure there are people who see it as Emma learned to love finally after not, this whole time. But like, there's definitely, I agree with your read. Like, I think that's definitely holds some water,
Yeah, she just doesn't seem like the kind of person who's going to be happy in a relationship like this.
Yeah.
In the long run. Maybe I'm wrong, but like, and again, I'm not saying that, people have read this book many times and they know it a lot better than me, but this is just my first pass on it, and then kind of what occurred to me and my sort of sense of who Emma was and what made me like her as a protagonist frustrated me at the end to see how she ended up. Like, I kind of wanted to see her stick to her guns and not marry. Right? And I understand that's a very modern thing, and that would be like way ahead of its time maybe, but that character falling back into the status quo, marrying like someone who is like appropriate status for her, securing their finances, and everybody slotting into where they're supposed to be in this class structure, which is where this novel ends. That doesn't feel like a happy ending to me. Maybe that's because I'm a lefty and this feels very, status quo conservative to me. But so maybe I'm bringing my own shit into it, but still, that's just how I read it. And I don't know. I didn't feel as like I felt happy for Elizabeth Bennet and the other guy. What's his name?
Mr. Darcy.
Mr.
Right?
Darcy. That's the guy's name. Yeah. Mr. Darcy. I'm bad with character names in general. It's not just these books. I genuinely was happy for them. I felt like it was this like really good romance, and I liked the way it ended. But here, I don't know. And I'm gonna be curious to see in the movie if they lean heavily in one way or another, if I have any of these misgivings, or if they play that up or not. I'm really curious. So we are going to be watching the 2020 film. That'll be the one we're going to cover. It's recent. I hear good things about it. And so we'll be covering that coming up soon, but we're actually going to have to release a bonus episode to the main feed next week because of some filming you're doing to where you're not going to be available to record. So it's unfortunate. We don't want to do it, but we are going to have to do that. We will also be covering Clueless, which is, I was looking at, like, one of the original movie adaptations of Emma is considered is Clueless. And we will be covering that on our Patreon at some point here, either this month or next month, I'm not sure, but pretty soon, I think. And if you'd like to go to our Patreon to support us, that's patreon.com/inktofilm, and you'll be able to get that episode when it comes out. Now, we are releasing some stuff to the main feed, but that's still like a year or two out, whereas you'll get the more recent stuff that we've been doing. And we'd love to have your support on there. Just a few bucks goes a long way for a small podcast like us. If you liked this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review, whatever app you chose to listen on. And again, like, you don't have to have listened to our entire podcast to leave a rating and review. You can just like this one episode. I think that's totally legitimate way to rate and review a podcast, because a lot of people just dip in and listen to like one or two, and it's still valuable to see somebody just say like, hey, I listened to the Pride and Prejudice, or listened to the Emma coverage, really liked it, left a review. I think people will love that.
Yeah, and if you didn't like it, fuck off. No, I'm just kidding. If you didn't like it, move on. Be sure to also connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at InktoFilm.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
Yeah, I'm really excited to watch this movie now, you know. Anya Taylor-Joy stars in it,
Yeah.
and that'll be coming, I believe, in 2 weeks.
Just watch your feed. You'll get it. You'll get it when it comes out. I'm really curious about this movie. I've heard good things. Anya Taylor-Joy apparently is really good in it. That's what I've been seeing. Excited for that. I think a woman director, which is always great. We haven't been able to cover many of those. So excited for that. And until next time.
Keep adapting.